It's a pleasure to be with you today, ladies and gentlemen. This is a momentous occasion. I applaud the Firm Foundation for putting on this seminar. It's unfortunate that our numbers are few oftentimes when we talk about the Constitution. My speech probably will differ from any other speech that you'll hear during this conference throughout the entire week. Because while I honor the Constitution and understand to its very depth all of the great and inspired provisions about it, we are dealing with a situation in the world where the Constitution is essentially dead. And we have to understand the realities, the political realities. We can't live in illusions anymore about either being the majority or about what it takes to restore the principles of liberty that we need to establish to either maintain our freedom or regain our freedom. I'm going to cover two parts in my presentation today. The first part is why the Constitution's essentially dead and what doesn't work to fix it. And the second part is what does work and why it's so difficult to accomplish. So I don't have a lot of good news, but what I do have is essential for your understanding so that you will not spin your wheels and waste your time as you go forward doing things that are non-productive. Now, a Constitution is supposed to provide the strict limitations on lawmaking power, not simply empower government to give people what they want. In the American tradition, the Constitution's purpose is not favorable to democracy. Despite what they talk about in the press all the time, despite what presidents say, we don't believe in raw democracy. The founders wanted to ensure that the majorities were not allowed to do anything that was not proper for individuals to do. Individual rights were paramount, not society outcome. So the founders had two main thrusts. First and foremost, they wanted to limit the powers of the central government, which was England at the time, so that it would not infringe upon the colonists' individual rights. But secondly, they wanted to limit the power of majority rule and its ability to legislate benefits to constituents. Even then, it was very well known that democracy always leads to socialism and the cry for benefits and the corruption politically that happens when you induce politicians to be able to buy votes with benefits. So to do so, they provided language to limit the federal government's legislative and executive authority to the common defense and to create a legislative branch with limited specified powers. Now, I know some of this historical background is not new to you, but it's important to set the groundwork. They also established a judicial branch with fairly unspecified powers, which became a problem. And they provided some limited tariff and excise tax revenues to fund the government and guarantee protection for a list of common law civil rights. Now, unfortunately, most of us believe that the Bill of Rights contains all of the rights that need to be protected. This is not true. It was only a limited list of some of the most important rights that had been historically aggrieved or infringed upon by governments, especially in England. But it did not cover all of the rights that we need to be protected. It didn't cover family rights and its ability to protect and determine the education and the values of their children. It didn't protect a great deal of certain individual rights. It didn't even establish a definition of fundamental rights that was workable, so that now the courts have been able to add rights that aren't true rights at all, like the right to an abortion. There's not a right that's in the Constitution, but they've inferred it through interpretation. In addition, there are false rights that are on the agenda and the process of being integrated as a portion of the Constitution, such as the right to free medical care. You can see that coming, can't you? The right to education, you can see that coming. But those are not true rights. The Bill of Rights was put into the Constitution to meet the demands of the Anti-federalists. Now, the Anti-federalists were not the bad guys. The Anti-federalists in the Constitutional Convention were really the good guys. They were the ones who were the most vociferous in their demands that we restrict and chain down government to the Constitution. And they demanded a Bill of Rights. They were not satisfied that the general language of the Constitution with specified powers would be enough to keep the government from morphing into tyranny. And guess what? After 200 years, who was right? Anti-federalists were right. Who were these anti-federalists? Well, they were people like George Mason, who actually wrote the Bill of Rights for the Virginia Constitution, which most of it got into the national Constitution. So even this great man voted against the Constitution because he didn't trust it to sufficiently safeguard our rights. But everything left over beyond the specified powers was given to the states or the people. Unfortunately, they forgot to distinguish what rights belong to the people and what rights belong to the state. And so the states ended up capturing the rights and left very little to the people. But why did the founders, wise as they were, do this? At the time of the convention, remember that the founders were the state governments. They were the delegates of the states. They trusted themselves not to violate individual rights. They didn't see a need in the Constitution to do that. And in addition, those that did see a need could not get there because to defend individual rights would have prohibited the states from continuing in the policy of slavery. And so in order to protect slavery in the southern states to get ratification, they did not make the Bill of Rights apply to the states, even though that was originally proposed in the first 12 amendments. But that trust in state sovereignty is very much misplaced. Corruption and cronyism quickly set in the decades that followed the Constitution Convention. State churches were formed. State monopolies in business were granted. Corruption became rampant. In the state of Nevada, shortly after becoming a state, the mining interests would brag to the newspapers that they owned every single Senate, state representative, and senator, lock, stock, and barrel. They had bought them. They had people gain positions in the California, and this happened whenever there was a gold rush, the California and Nevada legislatures, where people flocked in and they became states in a matter of very few years, and they were filled with turmoil, and the people that flocked to the state government were the typical carpetbagger types that were bought and paid for. Some didn't even have any legal experience whatsoever. The mining companies simply went out fishing for a businessman and said, we'll pay you $5,000 to become a representative, and we'll make sure you get elected. That's what kind of corruption there was. And it was that state corruption that led correctly for calls to the federal government to say somebody's got to rein in this state tyranny. A lot of conservatives don't realize that when they champion states' rights, that a great deal of the impetus to give the federal government more power came because of state corruption and state tyranny. In fact, the high point of that state tyranny was the Missouri extermination order for all members of a certain religious sect, the Mormons, which embarrassingly was still found on the books in 1976. But the Constitution was powerless to stop this kind of state tyranny because it wasn't included in the Bill of Rights. One of the main compromises, of course, that was made during the convention, as I said. Now, don't get me wrong. The United States Constitution was the grandest constitution ever devised up until that time or since. No other constitution has succeeded in limiting a national government in such a way. And yet it was filled with grand compromises, checks and balances, two forms of representation, separations of powers. Not because these were sure bulwarks against tyranny. They are not. They're compromises. But because they didn't have time in the exigencies of the moment, of the conflict. If you read about the convention of 1783, you'll find that there was a tremendous movement. There was irritation. There was hot working conditions. They were sitting there on their own dime. They weren't getting paid for this. They had farms. They wanted to get out. People would leave and not come back. It was just a miracle that anything happened at all, let alone work out all of the details of law which they had not anticipated. Checks and balances work by causing tension between the three branches of government. But they become totally ineffective as a limitation on tyranny when conspiring men gain control of all three branches of government. But with its compromises and flaws, the Constitution was literally the best they could get at the time. Every step of the way there was tremendous opposition from both those who trusted and wanted state power and those who wanted no further power at the federal level. So in hindsight, we can see that there was much inspiration and divine intervention in that process, even though the result wasn't perfect. In fact, I don't believe it was intended to be perfect. The Lord has testing purposes that he must preserve on earth, even as he tries to guide people into defending their liberties. He has to allow evil to have its day, its role, and evil has demanded and received its share at every period in history, of course, including our own, as you know. Now, we speak of the founders as if they were all one mind. I've been in this constitutional movement all of my life. My uncle is W. Cleon Skousen, one of the greatest champions of the Constitution. So I know about the tendency within our movement to talk about the founders. But the founders were not unified, far from it. In fact, among the founders, you had monarchists, you had statists, you had anarchists, you have state government people, you had you even had people like Alexander Hamilton, who pretended to be one of the limited government founding fathers, but in fact was a monarchist who wanted a more all-powerful state. But they were anything but united, except for the Battle of Ratification. The founders, in fact, became political enemies one for another. Even the ones like Madison and Jefferson who were united in the ratification of the Constitution. And what is the reason for that? It is precisely because they didn't work out the various issues that still divide us today. Now, when we stay within the general realm of simply studying the Constitution and honoring it, when you stay within the realm of generalities, you don't run into those. But when you study law, you do find that the language of generalities leads to multiple interpretations. In order to unravel those interpretations, it requires a great deal of legal structure, philosophy, jurisprudence, and they're not set in stone easily. Fortunately for the divine destiny of the Constitution and the United States, God intervened in that period of time in a way that made sure that a sizable core of principled men, real statesmen, had risen to prominence in several state governments, putting them in key positions to influence and direct this process. Now, I can't emphasize this enough. There hasn't been a time before or after in history where the Lord has allowed the best and the brightest of his own liberty-oriented people to rise to positions of power. At every period of time, there's been a few, but never have they been able to have a majority. And they barely had a majority in the founding. That's how close it was. But how the Lord manipulated that is that he allowed them to develop properties, to become wealth, to get involved in law, to get exposed to the right legal minds, the John Locke's, to become influenced, to see the dangers of democracy, and to study Roman history and the classical education, Black's law, and all of those types of influences that led to this convergence of the greatest minds being in state power. How many of our greatest constitutionalists are sitting even in a conservative state like Utah at the state government? They're not there. Look at our history of governors. John Huntsman and Michael Levitt, claiming to be conservatives, but very much establishment people who look at you, the constitutionalists, as an irritation, as a thorn in their side, someone who's going to restrict their ability to gain acceptance within the establishment. And indeed, our views do restrict their ability to gain acceptance. But the great men of the Constitution, Jefferson, Madison, Mason, Henry Lee, Washington, Franklin, didn't achieve their positions only through luck, only through capitalism, but it was through the divine intervention, in my estimation, of God. Now, few realize that the Constitution's meaning was under question and assault from the very day it's been ratified. Even fewer conservatives realize as well that the best of the founders became bitter political enemies with each other and fought for decades on issues that the Constitution did not clarify. 220-odd years later, I have the sad task to announce before this conference that the Constitution fought for and created by just men is essentially dead. It's not the gradual diminution of our rights over the centuries through interpretation by the courts that I refer to, as much as that is a part of the process, and as detrimental as it has been. It is more serious than that. It's more insidious. It's more grievous to overcome. It is that conspiring men have gained control of government such that they control both major political parties and all the core levels of law enforcement and justice, such that they can lie about their oath to the Constitution, violate it when necessary, and do so with absolute assurance that no power in government will prosecute them for it or remove them from office. I hope you got the full impact of what I just said to you. Now, I don't have time, and it's not the purpose of this talk, to give you a broad-ranging discussion on the nature of this conspiracy. And I can tell you it isn't necessary to know who's running it, because that's the biggest secret of all. And these people who are running it stay undercover. But it's enough to know that there is an evil, unseen hand that continues generation after generation, decade after decade, to guide this country towards a globalist New World Order, despite the Constitution, in spite of our own efforts to stop it. They can do so almost with impunity. And we can track that movement. We can see it happen, whether it's a Republican that gets into office or a Democrat. Do you remember when Bill Clinton came into office and he tried to get so many things through, including health care, and there was a great backlash against Bill Clinton, and George Bush ran on the premise that he was going to change the things and undo the things that Bill Clinton did. He didn't undo a single thing when he got into office. You remember what Obama ran on, what is about change that we can believe in? He hasn't changed anything that the Bush administration did of any substance. Now, I want to give you just a few of the highlights of what I would call legitimate proofs of a conspiracy, just so that you know that conspiring men do really exist at the highest levels of government. And we don't have many proofs of conspiracy. We have a lot of evidence of collusion and conspiracy. But they're tiny pieces of evidence. They're going through details of court cases and seeing how judges get turned and how things get overturned or covered up. We look at how the government deals with assassinations, how they deal with false flag terrorist attacks, and how they cover up the evidence and refuse to allow people to see what their inner workings are doing. These are evidences of conspiracy, but no clear proofs. In fact, we don't have and never will have anyone actually admitting to be right up there on top. They kill people for that. We do have evidence of many whistleblowers who come out, especially when a government goes to great extents to cover things up, whether it's their involvement in the Oklahoma City bombing or the downing of TW-800, the assassination of Martin Luther King, or the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Over time, tens and sometimes hundreds of whistleblowers come out and tell the truth. And the media has a real problem because they've got to debunk that. And they bring out organizations like Popular Mechanics, a professional debunking outfit, to present falsified evidence or skewed expert evidence to try to convince the bulk of the American people that conspiracy theory is evil, neurotic, and insane. They must denigrate the concept among Americans that there is a conspiracy, because it is the only thing that's capable of enraging America sufficiently to overthrow. But let me give you a couple of instances that show you how these things work. There is a power structure that controls politics, and they don't always put their people in the top positions. Oftentimes they use puppets. One of the classic cases was when Felipe González, the president of Spain, who was a socialist, got unelected through a major crisis of a scandal, I should say, in Spain. And so they decided they had to put in a non-controversial president. They chose a man, mild-mannered, small-town politician called José María Aznar. Joseph Maria, it's a typical name in Spain. Even a feminine name like Maria goes to men sometimes in honor of Joseph and Maria. But he was being interviewed after he became president by the Walter Cronkite of Spanish television called Iñaki Gabilondo. I happened to be in Europe at the time, and I heard this, and I couldn't believe my ears. It was just an amazing piece of evidence. Gabilondo, a leftist, prominent, though a sincere person, was interviewing the president and said, how is it that you, a relatively unknown in political office, came to be president of Spain? And Jose Maria Aznar said, well, the powers that be came to me and asked me to run. And he actually used those words. He said, los poderes que hay, the powers that be in Spanish. And Gabilondo, says, what do you mean the powers that be? We don't believe in powers that be. Who are these powers that be? And he said, well, the big labor unions, the big corporations, the media people, heads of political parties of a certain variety, they came to me, and bankers offered me to finance my campaign if I would run for president and take on certain advisors to guide my campaign. And Gabilondo was just apoplectic about this. I mean, here was a leftist who doesn't believe in conspiracies, having a president in an open interview on television tell him that the powers that be came and asked him to run. Well, he couldn't get anywhere with that, or didn't want to proceed, and so he said, all right, Mr. President, tell me what your first day in office was like. And he said, well, my first visitor that I interviewed was Henry Kissinger. And once again, Gabilondo went apoplectic. What was Henry Kissinger doing here? He doesn't even speak Spanish. What was he advising you to do? And he said, well, he was explaining to me how the world works. Now think about that for a minute. Henry Kissinger visiting the president of Spain, and Henry Kissinger doesn't know anything about Spain, but doesn't have to. He's telling a puppet president how the world works and who controls what and what he's got to do to stay alive and to stay in power. Now that's conspiracy. Now there's an even broader one that happened in February of this year, very recent, at the Munich Security Conference. They gave a special dinner for Henry Kissinger and honored him for all of his contributions to NATO and European security. The same Henry Kissinger who betrayed us in Vietnam, who gave away Taiwan's seat in the United Nations to Red China, did many other evil things, who gave the MIRV multi-warhead missile technology to the Soviet Union during the Nixon administration, and who various books that have been written have indicated controlled Richard Nixon during that entire administration. That's the man that they gave an award to. But the next day, the most interesting thing happened when General James Jones, the current National Security Advisor to Barack Obama, got up to address the crowd and began by saying how much he appreciated the conference giving this award to Henry Kissinger. And then he said, and this is the substance, you can get the actual quote today, still on the Council on Foreign Relations website, who have the entire speech. And he said, at the National Security Agency, we have a hierarchy. We get our daily marching orders from Henry Kissinger, filtered down through Brent Scowcroft and Sandy Berger, who are with us today. Now, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that's proof of a conspiracy, because it's an open admission that people who have no legal right to be advising, let alone dictating, giving orders to the National Security Advisor to Barack Obama are Henry Kissinger and his associates. Now, we who have studied conspiracy have known this all along, but to have an open admission that's still there on the internet that you can download and show to your neighbor is an indication of how bad we have got, because it's still up there. They haven't purged it from the internet. Do you ever see it in the press? How many of you have seen that quotation before? Look at that. Even among our own people, there's not a hand that's raised. Now, that's because nothing happens in America unless the media makes a major issue out of it. The media can even tell the truth on page 4 or 5. They can even tell the truth on page 1, and no one will get upset about it unless they make a drumbeat out of it, an issue of it. They know the American people and their dependency on experts and the establishment telling them what things are like. So I've given you a couple of examples here that you might understand that we do have proofs of conspiracy. There are many other quotes that I give to you, but it's not germane to our conversation. But as I said, these people can lie about their oath, they can violate it when necessary, and do so with absolute assurance. I can tell you that there's no one who has even proposed that General James Jones be investigated for a statement about getting daily operational orders from Henry Kissinger. No one in Congress, not the president, not even conservatives in Congress have challenged him on that. And that, to a certain extent, is because the United States establishment has learned to play conservatives like a book. And the favorite ploy that they have is like God, motherhood, and apple pie. They praise the Constitution, but they just lie about it. They do so to gain favor with the public. I want to give you an example of the pledge to America, the Republican new contract with America that was just produced this last week. I did a review of it in the World Affairs Brief, and if any of you want a sample copy of this, my analysis of the pledge of the World Affairs Brief, there are copies up here that you can get after my speech. With several major exceptions, the language in the Republican Party's new pledge to America is simply irresistible to constitutional conservatives. It has all the code words: consent of the governed, unalienable rights, stopping an unchecked executive, that are dear to conservative hearts. And yet this is a perfect example of how easy it is for the establishment leaders to jump on the Tea Party bandwagon of discontent and hijack the cause for their own purposes. Listen to their words. I mean, you'll just marvel at this if you haven't already. We pledge, these are the Republican leaders talking, we pledge to honor the Constitution as constructed by the framers and honor the original intent. I mean, doesn't that just make you want to get up and cheer? The Republican establishment is committing itself to the original intent of the Constitution. Now, I served as the chairman of the Conservative National Committee in Washington, D.C. during the Reagan administration, the most conservative administration there was, and they fought me tooth and nail over original intent. And yet we're to believe that the Republican establishment has suddenly turned around and been rebaptized and repentant and suddenly believe in original intent? And those precepts that have been consistently ignored, particularly the 10th Amendment, which grants that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited go to the states or to the people. Well, just a little bit further in the pledge, these same Republican authors commit to maintain entitlement programs which were never delegated to the federal government at all. You tell me, how is that honoring the intent, original intent of the Constitution? I call it the big lie. As many of my subscribers know, I'm only a fan, frankly, of the delegated powers restriction of the 10th Amendment.